All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today's deep dive takes us into the world of Sun Tzu's Art of War, but with a bit of a different angle. We're not just going to rehash military tactics, right? We're going to see how these 2,000-year-old ideas, these principles, how they actually play out in your life, in your work, in today's world.
Yeah, and to really help us with that, we're going to be looking at excerpts from this lecture I came across. It's got a really fascinating take on the art of war. It really tries to peel back these layers of interpretation and get to what Sun Tzu was really trying to say.
I love that. And you know what's even cooler? We've got these historical commentaries to guide us along the way, right? The Song Ben 11 Jia Zin Sunzi. I mean, that's 11 different perspectives on the art of war spanning
Yeah,
centuries.
it's like getting a front row seat to a conversation across history.
Yeah,
You've got all these military minds weighing in, debating, dissecting every single line of the text.
incredible. And one of these commentators, get this, is Cao Cao himself.
Hmm.
You know, the legendary figure from Romance of the Three Kingdoms.
Right. Talk about going deep.
So this lecture, it kicks off with this idea that really surprised me. It says that Sun Tzu's art of war isn't really about winning at all costs. It's about minimizing loss.
Yeah, that's kind of a mind bender, isn't it? I mean, we tend to think of warfare as this brutal, all or nothing kind of thing.
Exactly, where it's all about, dominance, victory at any price.
Right, but Sun Tzu seems to be suggesting a much more, I don't know, a smarter, more nuanced approach, where the real goal is to preserve yourself, preserve your resources, while you're still achieving your objective, of course.
It's like he's redefining what it means to be victorious.
He is, isn't he?
So how does he actually present this approach? Like, where do we even begin to unpack something as dense and complex as the art of war? I mean, it's kind of intimidating.
Yeah, well, the lecturer actually does a really good job of breaking it down for us. He boils it down to two fundamental principles.
Okay, I like it when things get simplified. Hit me with these principles.
Okay, so he calls them not to fight and not to lose.
Not to fight. Okay, that sounds a bit passive, especially coming from a military strategist.
Yeah, I know, right? It almost feels counterintuitive, like the opposite of what you'd expect from a book called The Art of War.
Exactly. So what's Sun Tzu really getting at here?
Well, he recognizes that like any conflict, even if you think you're going to win, there's always risk involved.
Oh, absolutely.
There could be unforeseen consequences, unexpected losses. Things could escalate in ways you just didn't predict.
Right. You never know how things will actually play out.
Exactly. So he's saying sometimes the wisest move is to avoid the conflict altogether.
Okay, so are we talking like full-on pacifism here, just hoping for the best, never engaging in any kind of struggle? I mean, that doesn't seem very practical.
No, it's definitely not that simplistic. It's more nuanced than that. Sun Tzu actually outlines three very specific scenarios where choosing not to fight is actually the most strategic option, even though, yeah, it might seem counterintuitive on the surface.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are these scenarios where restraint actually trumps aggression? Give me the lowdown.
Okay, so the first scenario is when you're facing an opponent who's just way stronger than you.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Pick your battles, right?
Right. Sun Tzu basically says that in these cases, it's foolish to just charge in head first. It's like inviting defeat, risking a total loss.
Yeah, that's kind of common sense, isn't it? Like, why pick a fight you know you can't win?
It seems that way, but think about it. How often do we see people making decisions based on ego or pride? This feeling of I am invincible, I can take on anyone.
Yeah, that's human nature for sure.
Right. So sometimes we're tempted to fight even when we're outmatched, just because we don't want to back down.
I can see that. Pride can definitely get in the way of making smart decisions.
It can. All right, so moving on to the second scenario. This one is about carefully considering the potential gains versus the potential losses. Sun Tzu's really big on this.
So it's like a cost-benefit analysis, weighing the risks against the rewards.
That's it. He's encouraging us to be really strategic, really discerning, not letting our emotions, or impulsive desires cloud our judgment.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment and not think things through.
Right. So sometimes the wisest course of action is to just conserve your energy, your resources. Wait for a better opportunity.
It's about being patient, strategic.
Exactly. And that brings us to the third scenario where not to fight is the best strategy.
Okay, hit me with number 3.
All right. So this one I think is particularly relevant to our world today, with everything moving so fast.
Yeah, we're all about instant gratification these days.
Right. And Sun Tzu cautions against getting sucked into conflicts that will distract you from your long-term goals
Hmm.
or that drain your resources unnecessarily.
Oh, I see. So it's about staying focused on the bigger picture, not letting yourself get sidetracked by every little squabble or shiny object that comes along.
Exactly. It's about having the discipline to stick to your vision, even when there are all these distractions, temptations. Like you said, that fear of missing out, FOMO.
Oh, FOMO. Yeah, that's a big one these days. We're constantly bombarded with messages that make us feel like we need to be doing more, having more, experiencing more.
Right? It's like we've forgotten the value of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act.
Sun Tzu was ahead of his time.
He really was. So those are the three scenarios where not to fight is actually the most strategic choice.
Okay, I'm getting it. Not to fight isn't about being passive or weak. It's about being smart, patient, and picking your battles wisely. It's about minimizing risk and not squandering your resources on unnecessary conflicts.
That's a great way to put it.
So what about the second principle, not to lose? How does that tie into all of this?
Not to lose. This one's all about establishing a strong foundation for success. Like a bottom line you never cross.
Yeah. So it's about protecting yourself, minimizing the downside.
Yeah, exactly. It's about actively managing risk,
Yeah.
making calculated decisions, setting clear boundaries for yourself.
So it's not just about being defensive, right? It's about being proactive in protecting your interests,
Yeah.
making sure you don't lose sight of what's important.
Exactly. It's about making sure you don't get wiped out completely. Even if you don't achieve total victory, you still come out ahead.
This is making me think about risk management in business or investing. You don't always go for the home run. Sometimes it's smarter to play it safe, protect your capital.
Absolutely. It's about sustainability, long-term success.
Okay, so I'm getting the theoretical side of not to lose, but can you give me a real world example? Like, how did this actually play out in history?
Well, one of the best examples comes from this fascinating story about Emperor Wen of the Han Dynasty and Zhao Tuo, who was the king of South Vietnam.
Oh, a power struggle. Tell me more.
So Zhao Tuo had rebelled against the Han Dynasty, right? Declared himself the ruler of an independent kingdom down in South Vietnam.
Bold move.
It was. And a lot of Emperor Wen's advisors were urging him to just crush the rebellion with military force, show everyone who's boss.
Classic might makes right thinking.
Exactly. But Emperor Wen, he took a different approach. He followed Sun Tzu's wisdom. Peace as most precious.
Okay, so he was more of a diplomat than a warmonger. But how do you negotiate with a rebellious king who's already declared his independence? That seems like a tough sell.
It was. But Emperor Wen, he was smart. He realized that Zhao Tuo's rebellion wasn't just about power. It was about cultural identity, too. About protecting his people's way of life.
Ah, so he needed to find a way to appeal to Zhao Tuo's heart, not just his head.
Exactly. And that's what he did. He came up with this brilliant three-part strategy to bring Zhao Tuo back into the fold without resorting to violence.
Okay, I love a good strategy. Lay it on me. What was the plan?
First, he sent people down to South Vietnam with instructions to care for Zhao Tuo's ancestral tombs.
Wow, that's interesting. A gesture of respect, showing he wasn't trying to erase Zhao Tuo's heritage.
Right. It was a powerful symbolic gesture, showing respect for Zhao Tuo's lineage, his culture.
Very clever. So what was the second part of the plan?
He gave honors and rewards to members of Zhao Tuo's family who were still living within the Han Dynasty.
Ah, so he's building bridges, not burning them, showing that loyalty to the Han Dynasty doesn't mean betraying your family.
Exactly. And finally, he sent a diplomat named Lu Jia down to South Vietnam with a letter for Zhao Tuo.
Okay, this letter must have been epic. Like, what kind of arguments could you possibly make to convince a guy to give up his kingdom?
Well, it wasn't what you'd expect. The letter was actually very humble, very conciliatory.
Really? So no threats, no promises of riches or power?
Nope. Emperor Wen basically acknowledged the horrors of war, the widows and orphans it would create, the suffering on both sides. He really emphasized his desire for peace and friendship. He appealed to Zhao Tuo's sense of humanity.
Wow, that's powerful stuff. So did it work? Did Zhao Tuo buy it?
He did. Lu Jia was a skilled diplomat too, by the way. He knew how to use reason and also a bit of subtle threats to reinforce Emperor Wen's message.
I bet. So it was a combination of the actions and the words, the stick and the carrot, that really swayed Zhao Tuo.
Exactly. And you know what? It worked. Zhao Tuo realized his rebellion was a mistake. He gave up his claim to the throne and pledged loyalty back to the Han Dynasty.
Amazing. A peaceful resolution achieved through, strategic, patience, empathy, and a willingness to understand the other side's point of view. That's incredible.
It is. And it's a perfect illustration of not to fight and not to lose in action.
It really is. And it makes you wonder, are there situations in our own lives where, seeking harmony and understanding would be more effective than just going head to head?
Right. It's something to think about.
It is. But before we get too deep into self-reflection, I want to go back to not to lose for a second. The lecture brings up this other really interesting idea related to this principle. It's about aiming for undefeated instead of victory.
Oh, yeah. He uses this great analogy to explain it. He talks about taking the law from above versus taking the law from below.
Okay, now I'm really confused. What's the law got to do with all of this? Break it down for me. What does it mean to take the law from above?
Well, if you're always aiming for the highest possible outcome, the absolute best result, that's like taking the law from above. But the problem is, you're setting no lower limit for yourself. So any deviation from that ideal can feel like a huge defeat.
So it's like setting yourself up for disappointment because you're basically aiming for perfection.
Exactly. It's like expecting to get a perfect score on every test or winning every single negotiation. It's just not realistic.
Yeah, you're setting yourself up for a lot of unnecessary pressure and stress.
Right. And it can make you afraid to take risks because you're so worried about failing.
Okay, so what's the alternative? What's this taking the law from below all about?
That's where Undefeated comes in. It's about setting a clear minimum standard for yourself, a baseline for acceptable outcomes.
So it's not about reaching the highest peak, but making sure you don't fall into the deepest valley.
Exactly. It's like having a safety net. You're not necessarily striving for the absolute best result, but you're also avoiding those catastrophic losses that can really set you back.
It's about minimizing the downside risk, protecting yourself from those fatal mistakes.
Right, and that's what makes Undefeated such a powerful concept. It's about resilience, long-term success.
I like that. It's not about winning every battle, but about surviving the war.
Exactly. And that's a mindset that can really help you achieve your goals in any area of life.
It's really making me rethink my whole approach to success. It's not about being perfect. It's about being consistent, making smart choices, and avoiding those major setbacks that can derail your progress.
And that's what Sun Tzu is all about.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground already, from not to fight and not to lose to the story of Emperor Wen and Zhao Tuo. And it's incredible how these ancient principles are still so relevant today. But I'm curious, does Sun Tzu actually get into the nitty-gritty details of warfare? Like, specific tactics and maneuvers?
He does. In fact, that's one of the things that makes the art of war so unique. It's not just about abstract philosophy. He gets into the practical stuff too.
So we're moving from the why to the how, from the big picture to the actual nuts and bolts of strategy.
Exactly. And that's where we'll pick up in our next segment. We'll dive into those tactical principles, see how Sun Tzu advises us to approach things like deception, adaptability, and exploiting our opponent's weaknesses.
Oh, I can't wait to hear about that. I have a feeling those insights will be just as relevant today as they were centuries ago. I'm still buzzing from all the insights we uncovered in the last segment, especially those principles, not to fight and not to lose. Like, they're so simple, yet so profound.
They really are.
Yeah.
And they lay the groundwork for understanding everything else Sun Tzu talks about.
Exactly. So now that we've got those foundational principles down, I'm ready to get a little more practical. Let's talk tactics. What are some of the specific strategies Sun Tzu recommends for, actually achieving victory?
Well, one of the most striking things about Sun Tzu's approach to warfare is his emphasis on deception. He even says at one point, all warfare is based on deception.
Deception. That sounds a little, I don't know, sneaky maybe. I always thought the art of war was more about honor and strategic brilliance, not like trickery.
It's not about being dishonest or unethical. It's more about recognizing that in any kind of conflict, there's an element of psychological manipulation involved. It's about understanding how your opponent perceives things and using that to your advantage.
So it's like a mental game as much as a physical one.
Exactly. Sun Tzu even talks about appearing weak when you're actually strong and vice versa. It's all about throwing your opponent off balance, leading them into making mistakes that you can then exploit.
Okay, I can see how that could be effective, but how does that translate to the real world? Like, I'm not planning on leading an army into battle anytime soon.
Think about a business negotiation, for example.
Yeah.
If you reveal all your cards right away, you're giving up your leverage. But if you strategically withhold information, maybe downplay your strengths a little, you can gain the upper hand.
Right. It's like in poker, you don't want to show everyone your royal flush right away. You got to keep them guessing.
Exactly. It's about being shrewd, calculated, understanding that Information is power.
Okay, so deception, it's about playing your cards close to your chest. What other tactical gems does Sun Tzu offer?
Another big one is adaptability. Sun Tzu was a big believer in being flexible, responsive to changing circumstances. He famously compares a skilled general to water, always flowing around obstacles, finding the path of least resistance.
So it's not about rigidly sticking to a plan no matter what. You got to be willing to adjust on the fly.
Exactly. The battlefield is constantly changing, just like life, right? If you cling to outdated plans or refuse to change course when things shift, you're going to get stuck.
Yeah, I've learned that lesson the hard way a few times.
We all have. But Sun Tzu gives us a framework for, doing that strategically. He says we should be constantly assessing the situation, identifying our strengths and weaknesses, and then adapting our approach accordingly.
So it's about being agile, mentally and strategically.
Right. You have to be able to shift gears, pivot when the situation demands it.
This is making me think about all those times I've stubbornly clung to a project or an idea, even when it was clearly time to move on.
We've all been there.
And maybe I need to channel my inner Sun Tzu a bit more. Embrace the change, adapt to the new circumstances and find a new path forward.
It's a good lesson for all of us.
Okay, so we've got deception and adaptability. What other tactical brilliance does Sun Tzu have up his sleeve?
Well, this one's kind of a no-brainer, but Sun Tzu really stresses the importance of striking at your opponent's weaknesses.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Focus your energy where it's going to have the most impact. But how do you actually identify those weaknesses?
Sun Tzu talks about the importance of careful observation, understanding your opponent's patterns, their tendencies. He says, attack when they are unprepared, appear where you are not expected.
So it's not just about brute force. It's about being strategic. Finding those pressure points where you can exert maximum impact with minimal effort.
Exactly. It's about leverage, using your strengths against their weaknesses.
This has applications way beyond the battlefield, right? I mean, I can see how this could be useful in business or even in personal relationships.
Absolutely. Imagine you're trying to launch a new product, for example. Instead of trying to compete head-to-head with the big guys, you can focus on a niche market they've overlooked or, a specific need they're not addressing.
Right. It's like finding that gap in the market, that unmet need that no one else is paying attention to.
Exactly. And that's where true innovation often lies. Not in brute force, but in strategic brilliance and creative thinking.
I love it. Okay, so we've got deception, adaptability, and striking at weaknesses. Any other key tactical principles we should be aware of?
One more that I think is really crucial for understanding Sun Tzu's approach. It's about knowing your enemy and knowing yourself.
Oh, yeah, that's one of his most famous quotes. Know your enemy, know yourself. Like a motivational poster material.
It is. But it's so much more than just a catchy phrase. It's really the foundation of all strategic thinking.
So what does it actually mean?
Well, on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward. You need to gather information about your opponent,
Right.
spy on their activities, analyze their strengths and weaknesses. But it's also about being brutally honest with yourself.
Oh, okay. So it's about self-awareness as much as it is about, opposition research.
Exactly. You need to understand your own biases, your tendencies, your strengths and weaknesses. You got to know what you're good at, what you're not so good at, where your blind spots lie.
That's tough. Sometimes it's easier to see the flaws in others than in ourselves.
It is. But that's where true wisdom lies, in the ability to be objective about both yourself and your opponent.
Okay, I'm with you. Know yourself, know your enemy, make decisions based on that knowledge. Simple but powerful.
Exactly. And that's what makes Sun Tzu's work so timeless and relevant. It's not just about winning battles, it's about understanding human nature, strategy, and the pursuit of success.
Okay, so we've covered deception, adaptability, striking at weaknesses, and knowing yourself and your enemy. That's a lot of tactical brilliance to unpack. But does Sun Tzu ever get into the really, really specific details of warfare, like formations and weapons and stuff?
He does. Remember how the lecturer was talking about how the art of war moves from broad strategic concepts to these tactical principles and then to even more specific considerations?
Yeah, I remember that.
Well, the third part of the text really gets into those finer points.
So it's like we're zooming in, getting more and more granular with the details.
Right. He talks about the importance of terrain, for example, how to use different environments to your advantage. He even gets into the psychological aspects of war, demoralizing your enemy, keeping your own troops motivated. And of course, there's the whole thing about spies and intelligence gathering.
Wow. It's amazing how much depth and nuance there is to this ancient text. I'm definitely feeling inspired to check it out myself.
Yeah.
But before we move on, is there anything else from the lecture that really stuck with you?
You know, one thing that really resonated with me was this idea that even in ancient times, military strategy wasn't just about brute force and annihilation. There was this real emphasis on preserving resources, minimizing casualties, you know?
So it's about being efficient, not just
Right.
winning at all costs.
Exactly. And I think that's a really powerful lesson for us today. In a world that often glorifies aggression and dominance, it's important to remember that true strength lies in knowing when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to walk away.
Wow, that's deep. It's like Sun Tzu is reminding us that the most strategic move is sometimes the one that avoids conflict altogether.
Maybe that's the most valuable lesson of all.
Well said. Okay, folks, we've reached the end of part 2 of our deep dive into Sun Tzu's Art of War. We've gone from those core principles not to fight and not to lose to all these amazing tactical insights.
We'll wrap up our exploration looking at the lecturer's final thoughts and some surprising connections between Sun Tzu's wisdom and, the world we live in today.
Stay tuned. This deep dive's far from over.